Now, before we get into these stories, I should warn you, if you look hard enough, you can find every single one of these in some old history book or a newspaper article or maybe even a 19th century collection of folktales. But despite that, make no mistake, all of these stories happened to me personally. These are all first-hand accounts. It's just pure coincidence that all this stuff also happened to somebody else a long time ago. So, with that out of the way, do you want to hear about maybe the worst fear I ever felt in my whole life? This little story happened to me when I spent a winter living up in northern Maine. Just about the coldest winter that I ever experienced, too. One morning, I woke up in my little cabin and I decided that I wanted some duck for breakfast. So I headed out into the snow to see if I could find myself a bird or two. After some walking, I came across a great big pond with about 200 great big fat ducks sitting out in the water. I leveled my rifle, and bang, I fired right into the flock. The birds, they started to squawk and flap their wings around, but strangely, none of them were actually taking flight. They were just sitting right there in the water, flapping and making noise without going anywhere. So, I walked on down to the shore of the pond to see what was going on, and my eyes about popped out of my head. The whole pond had been frozen solid, with all those ducks trapped in the ice. They must have been sleeping the night before when a nasty cold front came through and froze them in solid. Their bodies stuck in the ice with their heads and wings free and flapping. Now, I just had to get a better look at the ducks, so I walked on down to the shore and out onto the ice, and as I did, the ducks really started to get upset. All 200 of them started beating their wings harder and harder, and before long, with all that activity, the ice started to move around under my feet. At first, I thought the ducks were just going to crack the ice and drop me into the freezing water, but no, that would have been just a little bit too ordinary for a Maine winter. See, what those ducks were actually doing, by all flapping together, was raising the whole sheet of ice up and out of the pond. Their combined wing power was hoisting that cake of ice higher and higher up into the air, with me standing right there in the middle of it. And pretty soon, before I knew it, I was sailing along high above those Maine pine wood forests, just trying my best not to slip and slide off the edge down into the treetops. I tell you, I hardly been more scared in my whole life. We didn't even start to come down until the ducks flew far enough south that the warm sun down there started to melt the ice and free a few of the ducks. Little by little, that patch of ice got smaller and smaller, with more and more of the ducks escaping its clutches, until I found myself being gently sat back down on the ground, right in the middle of some road that I didn't recognize at all. So I looked around a little, and I saw a husky-looking country boy working the fields of a nearby farm. I walked over to the kid and I said, "Hey, could you tell me where this road goes?" Well, that farm boy, he didn't even look up from his work. He just said, "I never seen it go anywhere. All my life, it's always stayed right where it is now." So I said, "Well, how far is it to the next town?" "I don't know. I never measured it," he said back. I guess the stress of my flight must have been affecting me or something, because when I heard that, I got pretty hot. I lost my temper and I yelled, "You must be the biggest fool I ever met in my whole life." Well, that kid, he straightened up tall, he looked me right in the eyes and said, "Well, I ain't the one who's lost." And that shut me up. Eventually, though, I did find somebody who could help me out. I asked where I was, and to my astonishment, I learned that those ducks had flown me all the way down to Texas. Luckily, though, the nearest town wasn't too far away, and so I got to walking and started on down the road to civilization, eager to have a hot meal and a drink. When I finally made it to town, though, I was surprised to be greeted by a big crowd of townsfolk, all yelling and screaming. I got in close to the group and I started asking around, and I learned that a tragic death had just befallen this little prairie community. A young man had just died, his body still laying right there fresh in the street, right before my eyes. And what's more, this man was actually the third one in his family to have keeled over and died in just the last week. Now, if I remember this next part correctly, as the townsfolk told me, the whole thing started just a few days before I got to town, when an old cattleman had been bitten in the ankle by a rattlesnake. The poor man ended up passing away not too long after the bite, and his son inherited the pair of boots that he had been wearing when he got bit. Oddly enough, though, the cattleman's son ended up keeling over too, just one day after he first pulled on his dad's old boots. So, next, the cattleman's grandson took the boots as a sort of family heirloom, and now, as sad as it is to say, it was that grandson that was lying dead there in front of me in the street that day. At first, the town had just thought that the deaths were some kind of cruel coincidence. But then, the undertaker noticed that there was a weird little small scratch on the inside ankle of both the son and grandson, leading the townsfolk to believe that there must have been some kind of foul play afoot. Now me, as soon as I heard about those scratches, I had myself a hunch. I marched up to the front of the crowd, I picked up that old pair of boots, and I very carefully dug my hand around on the inside for a minute, and wouldn't you know it, I found myself a pair of rattlesnake fangs lodged right there in the leather. I guess that old snake had lost his fangs in the boot when he bit the cattleman, and so the fangs had gone on to bite the son and grandson when they pulled on the boots themselves. Man, it is pretty crazy that all that started from a simple bird hunting trip, right? Like, I tell you, after that experience, I was about ready to give up the sport right then and there. I understood pretty well how old Mrs. Marty Bass must have felt when she decided to give up bird hunting. See, if you haven't heard this story, Mrs. Bass was my neighbor when I used to live up in Maine, and she had warned me way before the flying ice incident that weird things tend to happen when you go bird hunting in Maine. And she had a good story of her own to prove it, too. See, when I first moved up to northern Maine, one of the first things I noticed is that every so often you'd see a bird flying around that, hand to my heart, looked like it had a sweater on. Yeah, just a regular old partridge flapping through the trees wearing a tiny little hand-knit sweater. It was very strange to see, and I just couldn't figure out where they were getting those things. So, one day I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Bass, about it, and to my surprise, she told me that the bird sweater phenomenon was all her fault. I asked how that could possibly be, and she launched into one of the most fantastic stories I'd ever heard. See, the whole thing started about a year before I came up to Maine. Mrs. Bass was out bird hunting on a cool autumn evening when she spotted a partridge sitting up in a nearby tree. She leveled her shotgun, drew a bead on the animal, and pulled the trigger. And amazingly, Mrs. Bass completely missed the bird while somehow also knocking off every single one of his feathers. That bird was sitting there in the tree, unharmed, but completely naked. I guess the shock of sudden nakedness must have scared the poor bird half to death though, because he fainted right then and there in front of Mrs. Bass. Now, Marty Bass was a real sentimental type, and she had felt so bad about the whole thing that she set herself upon knitting up a little bird-sized sweater for that partridge. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving him out in the cold with no feathers, especially when the cold Maine winter was about to hit. And so, before long, she had that naked partridge sitting pretty in a brand new hand-knit sweater, cozy as could be. She took him back out into the woods and let him go, and thought that would pretty much be about the end of it. She didn't think much of that partridge again through the whole winter. But then, springtime rolled around, and Mrs. Bass caught sight of something that took her breath away. There, in front of her, flew her old friend the partridge, with 5 little baby partridges flying behind him, all wearing miniature versions of that same sweater that their daddy had on. I guess that partridge had some real dominant genes. And he liked to get busy too, apparently, because by the time I came up north, it wasn't uncommon at all to see those sweater partridges flying by. Seemed to me like Mrs. Bass accidentally invented a whole new species. And I knew how she felt too. Like, one time I was trying to cook up a fish for dinner when the little morsel just jumped right out of the frying pan back into the water. On the way though, he accidentally hooked his tail on the pan and yanked the whole thing in after him. And boy, I'll be damned if I wasn't catching little baby fish out of that lake with little baby frying pans hooked to their tails for years after that. But if you think that's a crazy fishing story, Then wait till you hear about the time that I tried to fiddle around with the laws of nature, one of the saddest events of my whole life. The whole thing started when I was sitting on the shore of a small lake, casting a line out into that beautiful blue water. It was a nice day that afternoon, and I was reeling them in pretty good, casting and catching and casting and catching, when suddenly I noticed that I had a trout on the end of my line that looked just a little bit different than the others. He had a real high forehead and a smooth face, and most strikingly of all, these real bright, intelligent eyes. So I looked at that trout there in my hands, and I realized that I had an opportunity. See, all my life I had thought it possible to tame a trout the same way you might tame a dog or a cat, and I just never seen a fish before that I thought had the right spark. But this little trout, he looked to me like he just might have it. So I took the little trout home and I put him in a tub of water, and I started thinking about what I could do to domesticate that little fish. And after a little brainstorming, I think I came up with a pretty good idea. See, you know how you can kind of build up a tolerance to, say, spicy food by eating hotter and hotter foods until you get used to the heat? And you know how you can build up a tolerance to certain kinds of poison by taking a tiny amount, bit by bit, until your body just sort of gets used to it? Well, I thought I might apply a similar principle to my new friend the trout. So that evening, I snuck up to his tub while he was sleeping, and I let just a little bit of water out of the tap that was at the bottom of the tub. And the next night I did the same thing, and the next I did it again, and the next, 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 and before I knew it, my little fish was sitting at the bottom of a completely bone-dry tub, alive and well. I had successfully helped him build up a tolerance to breathing air, and all without him knowing about it too, because I'm pretty sure if I had told the fish about my plan ahead of time, he would have died as soon as that last bit of water passed his gills. But instead, me and my trout were off to the races. We had a wonderful summer together. He followed me everywhere, flopping along behind me. Pa, 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 pa. Everywhere I went, there he was, flopping along the trail along with me. Hell, he might have been a better hiker than I was. And while I was at it too, I taught him to do a few tricks. He could play the jaw harp, he could catch flies with his tongues, and I'll be damned if I didn't sell quite a few tickets to folks hoping to see him walk a tightrope. But I guess in the end, we must have just been having a little bit too much fun together that summer. Because near the end of the season, something happened that still hurts to talk about today. Me and my trout, we were out for a walk when we came to an old bridge stretched out over a river. I stepped out onto the boards first, with the sound of my trout flopping along behind me. Pow, 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 pow. You know, I'd gotten so used to the sound over the last few months that it had just become real comforting to me. Which is why it was more than a little bit worrying when that sound disappeared as we were crossing that bridge. Yeah, we were just about halfway across when I realized that I couldn't hear the slap of my fish anymore. So I looked behind me, and I realized, with horror, that my little trout had fallen through a crack in the boards. Immediately, I raced over, and I peered down into the river below, but it was just too late. My little trout had drowned, just like that. Still brings a tear to my eye today. And you know, I pretty much swore off fishing for quite a while after that. I just couldn't bear the thought of holding another fish in my hand and looking him in the eye. If I remember right, it wasn't until I was down in Pennsylvania one day that I finally got coaxed back into the hobby. A man that I met in Philadelphia was telling me about a lake out in the countryside where the fish chewed tobacco, and I just couldn't help but satiate my curiosity. So he and I drove on out to the lake for a quick fishing trip. And when we got there, I went to grab my rod and reel out the truck when my host handed me a club instead. See, the way you catch fish at that lake is to chuck a plug of tobacco out into the water, let the fish chew on it for a while, and then club them over the head when they come up to the surface to spit. Pretty wild, right? And, you know, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure that was the same autumn that I was later passing through Arkansas when I heard tell of just about the mightiest fish that you ever could catch in your life. A big bruiser swimming around in the Arkansas River, just a hair south of Little Rock. townsfolk there had been trying and failing to catch that fish for months until I came around and suggested that maybe they should bend a crowbar into the shape of a fish hook and throw that out there for the monster to munch on. And I tell you, it worked, because before long we had just about the whole town yanking on our end of the rope trying to haul that sucker in. We were pulling and heaving and hoeing, and believe me, to this day, I'm still not much of a handshaker on account of them rope burns. Eventually, though, we did get him landed, and when they cut him open, they found a whole yoke of oxen and a few hogs inside his guts. Whew, he was a big one. But then again, everything's big down there in Arkansas, even the rainstorms. Hell, take it from me. Sometimes it rains so hard in Arkansas that you gotta jump into the river just to keep from drowning. But that's a story for another day. I'll see you next time.